Welcome to the Josh Button Podcast, where we discuss health, wellness, and outliers from society. What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to the Josh Button Podcast. Today is a very special episode. I'm really stoked to get into this conversation on several topics, but first and foremost, Mark Gober is the author of the Upside Down series. It's 7 books, correct? And it spans consciousness science, medicine, politics, cosmology, economics, and more. And more. Let's get into it, man. I want to know your history, how you came to these discoveries in the first place. It's a broad spectrum, and you've definitely filled the airwaves lately with all kinds of information across every facet I can imagine. So how'd you come to this? What's your personal history?
I never expected to be doing this. I want to start by saying that. I have a background, which I'll walk you through, and on the surface, it will sound like it has nothing to do with my books or what we're going to talk about in this interview. Although I can trace the steps back and see how it all fits together. But I was a very achievement-focused person growing up. I was a competitive tennis player, always wanted to get good grades, was very social. Went to Princeton for undergrad. I was one of the captains of the tennis team there. On that same track, just wanted to challenge myself as much as possible and do as well as possible in many different areas. I went into investment banking after graduating. This was in 2008. So I was in New York during the height of the financial crisis. So I lived through that firsthand. I didn't even really know why I was doing it beyond I thought it would be a good place to start my career. And it was very tough. I thought that with my background, I had gone through a lot of tough things, especially being a Division I athlete, but this was a different level of challenge that I wasn't, in some ways I was prepared for, in other ways I wasn't. So that led to a lot of just existential questions. What am I really doing here? I wasn't getting quite into where I was writing books, but I was asking questions of like, why do I go to work every day? Is this what life is about? I didn't have good answers to it because at the time I was more of an atheist agnostic, and I thought life was random and meaningless because that's what I thought science was teaching us. In any event, I knew whatever I was doing there, I didn't want to continue forever. So I left and joined a firm that was a spin out of the Boston Consulting Group, which is one of the big consulting firms in the world, advising companies on strategy. So this group that I joined was a spin out. So people who used to be at the Boston Consulting Group, they created a firm to be able to help technology focused companies with their innovations, in particular their patented technologies. So I started off in their Boston office and then moved out to Silicon Valley, which is where I spent most of my time. And I had to learn how to learn about complex topics, especially new technologies that I knew nothing about, whether it was in the field of semiconductors or alternative energy, you name it. Basically, every field is innovating in some way, and therefore they're patenting things. And I had to learn about those inventions and work with the inventors and be able to speak about this stuff in an intelligent enough way to communicate it to the CEOs and boards of directors. So I had to translate a lot of the stuff I was learning, and then, Mark, by tomorrow morning, we need this done with no errors and have all the citations. So this was my training to learn about topics I knew nothing about, become fluent enough about it to speak intelligently, and then develop not just a synthesis, but be able to have recommendations and strategies for my clients. And of course, I had colleagues that were guiding me through this in the beginning, but eventually I made it to become a partner at the firm. But even while I was in this field, there were certain clients I worked with that were definitely inspiring to me because they invented things that I thought were super important. And I felt like the big companies were coming and infringing on their patents, and I wanted to help them out. And then I worked with some really big companies. I thought they had amazing inventions, and it was fun to help them to protect those inventions. But then there was this part of me that just didn't find that much meaning in it. Like there was something missing. And I was still very much not believing that life had any meaning to it beyond what I was making up, because I thought it was all just random. And that was tougher and tougher to deal with as the ups and downs of life hit. It's just harder to withstand things when you don't believe there's any fundamental purpose behind what you're going through. It's like, we're all going to die anyway. Why am I working so hard? Why does this even matter? Or even if something really good happened, I'd say, well, we're all going to be dead. Why does it matter? And I actually, given my belief system, that was a rational line of questioning. But I was in a dark night of the soul, as I would now call it, in 2016. And astrologically, which I didn't know about at the time, it's known as a Saturn return based on my chart, where like your life gets shaken up around age 30. So it was a perfect storm of a lot of things in my personal and professional life that were not going the way that I wanted. And I was just felt like a zombie. So because I thought I had life figured out, or I thought the scientists did, and I just believed them, I didn't think there was anything to change about my worldview, but I did start listening to podcasts. Initially, it was Tim Ferriss's show. A buddy of mine sent me a Tim Ferriss episode with Mark Andreessen, a venture capitalist. I was like, wow, this is a really cool thing, these podcasts, because they were newer at the time, where you can listen to smart people talk about a wide range of topics. So I started listening to more shows, and I started listening to alternative health concepts. So people who were dealing with anxiety using psychedelics. It wasn't the path I wanted to take, but I was just fascinated by the way that people were using alternative health. And I came across a show called Extreme Health Radio, which is still on the air. And I learned about people curing themselves of all sorts of illnesses using non-mainstream medicine. And that was really cool to me. But then one day I heard a woman speak on that show, Extreme Health Radio. Her name's Laura Powers. And she was talking about using psychic abilities to help heal and advise her clients, and even speaking with interdimensional intelligences and spirits and that sort of thing. The hosts of the show, who were otherwise, they seemed to be really in tune with science, they were listening to what she was saying and sort of like, oh, wow, that's really interesting. They weren't denying it or saying this woman's crazy. So I was having all kinds of cognitive dissonance, and it wasn't like my life changed in that moment. But at the end of the episode, Laura mentioned that she has her own podcast called Healing Powers, which is still on the air. And I said, okay, I'm going to listen to that podcast. And I listened to episode after episode of person after person from different parts of the world, different areas of life, describing a view of reality that had nothing to do with what I thought was true. They were talking about the reality of spirits and the afterlife and psychic abilities and some kind of interconnected consciousness, things that sounded very spiritual to me. So I was resistant. I'm like, no, because I thought spirituality and religion, that's superstition. But it was person after person, including some scientifically minded people. Even a Princeton grad, Paul Davids, who was the Hollywood producer of the Transformers, he was talking to Laura about the Life After Death project, where one of his deceased colleagues began communicating with him. And he did a documentary on it. Then he wrote a book called An Atheist in Heaven, where he documents something like 300 different events that could not be explained by anything, including an ink blot that appeared on his papers when he was home alone, left the papers, came back, there was wet ink, he didn't put it there, and the words crossed out related to the person that had died. So he sent the ink to chemistry labs that he paid for himself to analyze the ink. And those chemistry labs, after several years, said there were anomalies that they couldn't explain. So I was hearing this stuff and I'm like, whoa, I know the education this guy had because we went to the same school. He's super rational. And there were many other people like that. So I started to read books and scientific papers. The University of Virginia's Division of Perceptual Studies at the medical school there. Princeton University had a lab called the PEAR Lab, the Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research Lab, which I didn't even know about, run by the former Dean of Engineering, the Institute of Noetic Sciences, the U.S. government's declassified psychic spying program, and started in the 70s. And I was like, oh, wow, there's a lot of stuff here. And I went down a major rabbit hole, reading everything I could find, listening to every podcast I could find. And long story short, it led me to write my first book a year later called An End to Upside Down Thinking, which was published in 2018. Then I did a podcast series called Where is My Mind? It's just 8 episodes. We tried to make it bingeable with Blue Duck Media. It's still available, even though it came out in 2019 and still relevant on the topic of consciousness. Then end of 2019 hit. I decided to leave my firm after making it to partner. It was a really tough decision because I had a great future career-wise, but I was pulled by this other stuff. And since I left my firm, 6 new books have come out. So An End to Upside Down Living, which is on the spiritual awakening path and the implications of a lot of those things I had mentioned about these phenomena. Then I wrote An End to Upside Down Liberty, which challenges the conventional view of government. An End to Upside Down Contact was next, which talks about contact with non-human intelligences, not just UFOs, and even though that's part of it, but also in interdimensional realms, like with near-death experiences when people encounter beings or psychedelics or other things like that. Then I wrote An End to the Upside Down Reset, which is a critique of the World Economic Forum's stated vision for society that was laid out in 2020. Then An End to Upside Down Medicine, which is a challenge to all sorts of aspects of the allopathic approach to medicine. And most recently, An End to the Upside Down Cosmos, which is a challenge to mainstream cosmology, ranging from the Big Bang even to more controversial issues like the debate about Earth's place in the cosmos and what Earth is. And that's where we are today, Josh.
That is absolutely amazing. You were absolutely perfectly prepared for what you're doing.
In hindsight, I was trained to do this, and I didn't realize it at the time. And it's interesting because I look back at my past in the first 30 years, really, even though I continued a little bit in my job once I came across this stuff, that there was a lot of pain that was involved in that. I mean, it didn't come naturally to just sit there and work all night and spend a lot of time in isolation because I was working on stuff for my clients for years or training for tennis so hard. But I can see that allowed me to do these books and to be able to communicate stuff because I was trained to do that for years.
I lived in New York during that same 2008 phase, and I guess I can attribute some of the effects of just New York City in itself and the grind and falling in line with some of your thinking on that we're here for more, or we have to be here for more, even if we don't understand that that's what we're feeling. And, it pushes us out and we seek out other things. And it's amazing how we find these things that do end up preparing us perfectly for what we actually are meant to do. So it sounds like you have hit the nail on the head there, that you were being perfectly trained for this. You eloquently described several of these topics on several of the podcasts I've seen you on, several of the interviews, but specifically medicine. How did you come about realizing that allopathic formulas were just so devastatingly wrong? And did you feel that these other modalities were being hidden from us for profit? Or what is your entire grasp on the medicine and allopathic in the West?
It's really interesting you're asking me that, Josh, because that topic seems to be the hottest one, the one that people want to talk about most right now. I don't know what's in the air or in the ether. Something's going on, and I'm glad you asked about it. I first became interested in alternative health when I was researching the consciousness topic starting in 2016, because I was listening to all these health shows and hearing things that contradicted the mainstream narrative, whether it was different types of supplements or the power of the mind to heal or using energies like Reiki and that sort of thing. So I was into that when I first learned about these topics. And I would go to Reiki healers and every kind of healer you could imagine, and psychics and people who were working with my energy and different nutritional diets. I was exploring all that stuff and seeing various changes. But I wasn't going to write a book about it. I mean, it was integrated somewhat in the work I was doing on consciousness, but I hadn't gotten to the point where I was even considering a book on medicine. And then everything in 2020 happened. And I want to be careful with the words I use here. I don't know if this is going to be on YouTube.
Yeah.
Is it going to be on YouTube?
It is. I put it on YouTube, Rumble, but don't filter yourself. I'm not worried about monetization.
Okay. I want to be careful because I know this is a topic that they are very, they're attuned to. So I'll do my best. But in 2020, we know what happened and there were a lot of questions. And so I started looking into things. And I remember at the time that there were like those who questioned the narrative and then those who went along with it. That was the basic divide very early on. At the time, I had no real knowledge of, let's just say, the fact that governments could be so deceptive and that there was such corruption in certain industries. Before that, I knew that there was corruption in the academic field relating to consciousness science. So much of it was being suppressed. But this other stuff, this was a next level thing. We're talking about global organizations and governments and the media and censorship. So I saw the censorship really quickly where things were being taken off YouTube if they contradicted the narrative. And I'm like, what is going on here? Because some of these people who were being censored, I remember there was one ER doctor in particular in Northern California. He got on and said, I'm in the hospitals and what is happening here is not as severe as what they're saying on the news. And this guy got crushed and he was taken off YouTube. And I'm saying, what is happening? Because this is a credible medical doctor here who's actually seeing stuff and his stuff's being censored. So I was looking at all the alternative stuff. I had just left my job. So I had all this free time on my hands and I had just written the book and End Upside Down Living. So I was just sitting there observing. And I remember Brian Rose had this freedom platform. I forget the name of it, where it was like one of the only places where people could actually talk freely. So Robert F. Kennedy Jr. was on there, David Icke, and they were speaking about an agenda about injections, the word. And the idea, which sounded very conspiratorial at the time, was that everything that was happening was geared toward a injection agenda to control people's behavior and put stuff in your bodies. So I was listening to that and saying, that sounds pretty wild. Let's see what happens. And that was an outlandish thing to say, which now is not a very outlandish thing to say. But then there was something even more outlandish that I heard a few times, starting with Dr. Andrew Kaufman. Who, by the way, really smart guy. I mean, MIT, Duke, University of South Carolina trained, really smart person. He gets on Brian Rose and other platforms and says, yeah, I agree that we've got these other issues, but SARS-CoV-2 has never been isolated. The thing that this entire 2020 lockdowns and masks and everything, it's based on something that doesn't exist. So I remember hearing that. I was like, that sounds pretty wild to me, but I don't have counter arguments to what he's saying. So I just kind of kept it in the back of my mind. And I figured if this was some kind of psyop just designed to divide the health freedom world, which is what a lot of people believe, then this would go away, that there would be good counter arguments to it. And it just kept hanging around. And I was writing books and other things. And it wasn't until 2023 where I got really interested in looking into it myself, because many of the arguments are extremely technical. It gets into methodologies in terms of what's done in virology labs. So these are things that medical doctors wouldn't even know. So I wasn't at the time going into that stuff. I spoke at a conference in Tennessee called Rebels for a Cause. It was hosted by Courtney Turner. She's the host of the Courtney Turner podcast. I had been on her show, so she invited me to come speak. And I was speaking about consciousness and things like that and tying it to maybe sociopolitical things. But it was mostly political conference, and I was maybe an outlier. And Alex Zeck, who hosts the Way Forward podcast, he was there also talking all about the flaws of virology. So I heard a bit of his talk, and he and I chatted afterwards, and he invited me to be on his library or series. It's called The End of COVID. It's still available at theendofcovid.com. And he invited me to speak about my political stuff. So this is World Economic Forum, lockdowns, liberty, voluntarism versus statism in political theory, all that stuff. So I was a participant on 3 of the panels in The End of COVID. And then because I had access to all these 100+ hours of content, I started listening to some of the doctors who were questioning the virus narrative. And then I realized, okay, there's a reason they're still talking about this years later, even though we've had multiple years of lockdowns and many people that believe there's this almost invisible particle that's microscopic, that's going from person to person. And I realized there's something here. I will say that before I sat down to write the book, I was not sure if it could be a book, because I said, this is too much. I'm going to lose people. They're going to think I'm nuts. And I don't know if the arguments are strong enough. So the book writing process was almost my process of trying to convince myself that there was an argument to challenge not just the consciousness part of allopathic medicine, which is left out, but even the germ theory part of allopathic medicine. And I realized, okay, there's a lot here. I'm going to go forward with this. And it's a mind-blowing shift in how we think about our own health, but I think ultimately an empowering one.
Yeah, absolutely. I had Jacob Diaz, the undercover virologist, on here. He's from the Alex Zeck, and that group as well. And the compelling arguments are one-sided at this point for me. I literally, after I went into it a good bit, I didn't fear germs to begin with. I don't think I had that basis so programmed into me that I was pushed in, the fear direction when it came up in 2020. And some of the decisions I made were very different than the community I was living closely with in Southern California. And if you were in California, it was pretty intense there. So my eyes were open and ready to receive this information. As soon as I saw a good bit about it, I went down the wormhole myself, and yeah, I'm complete anti-germ theory. I guess terrain theory is the way to go. So when you started writing that book, did you try and steel man the virus theory, the germ theory?
Yeah, I was trying to come up with the counter arguments, because I figured, and let me take a step back, because germ theory is a term that's thrown around. And basically what it means is that there exist these microbial particles or organisms that cause disease on healthy tissue or healthy individuals, and that they can be transmitted from one organism to another. This is such a basic idea, so foundational to our world, that it's almost crazy to say that. It's like, oh yeah, obviously, Mark, that's true. We know that. We've got microscopes. We can see these things. Obviously, a bunch of people went to a party and they got sick afterwards, so they caught something. And that's the thinking. And so I was trying to say, like, okay, there must be a ton of evidence for that. Really solid science. And the word science is important because we're referring to the scientific method. I'll get to that in a second. And I just haven't found it. And I've pointed to some of the doctors like Andrew Kaufman, Dr. Tom Cowan, Doctors Mark and Sam Bailey in New Zealand, and a bunch of others who are now speaking out. Even Michael Yeadon, who was a VP at Pfizer, is talking about this. And Denis Rancourt, who's a professor in Canada. So there are more people who are looking at this and speaking about it with credible voice. And that was alarming to me, because what the general tenor is, there is no solid scientific evidence for the germ theory of disease. And that doesn't mean that people don't get sick. This is an important distinction. The argument here is, yes, people get sick. Sometimes they can die because their symptoms are so severe. The question is, what caused the symptoms? Is it a microscopic organism, or is it something else? Is it toxins in the environment? Is it EMFs? Is it something more energetic? Is it something to do with our psychology and our emotions? And if we're shocked by something emotionally, can that affect us? Like it's talked about in German New Medicine. The point is, there are many reasons that something can happen. And the key logical fallacy that I find myself talking about everywhere, the fancy name for it is affirming the consequent. But the basic way to think about it is this. Statement 1, which is a true statement. If it rained last night, the grass this morning will be wet. Yeah, it's true. The second statement is where we have problems, and this is the fallacy. People will say, I see wet grass this morning, therefore it rained last night. So while it's true that the model that it rained last night can accurately explain the observation, it doesn't mean that that model is the correct model of causation. Because why? What else could have happened? There could have been dew. There could have been sprinklers. There could have been children running by and pouring buckets of water. There are probably an infinite number of explanations for why the grass is wet. And what happens in the modern world, whether it's political or scientific or medical, we tend to jump to one causal explanation and then retrofit any new observations into that model that we've created. So a bunch of people get sick at a party and they come home with similar symptoms. They say, I caught something, even though no one has seen this thing going inside their cells and doing all the stuff it allegedly does. They say, we caught something, and then that becomes the model of the germ theory of disease. And there are other indirect reasons why people believe that's true. The problem is there are many other reasons that people could get sick. And when trying to validate the germ theory of disease, because this should be super easy to prove, and we can talk about this, the studies are not done in a way that follows the scientific method, meaning there's no independent variable and there's a lack of proper controls. So by definition, we are in the realm of pseudoscience. And this is something I've played around with AI on, where I've gotten it to confess after a lot of prying and showing it data and showing it logic that, especially as it comes to virus isolation, it is a pseudoscientific endeavor.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. How clever do you get when you start putting these prompts into AI? Because you've done it for multiple subjects. And exactly how clever do you have to be to get these confessions?
The important first step is knowing the subject matter really well. So because I've written the books, I've had to dive into all sides of it. So it's almost like I'm having the consensus mainstream person coming back at me. And I have a lot of practice with dealing with that. So I will end up presenting it with facts that it might have access to, but it's not going to prioritize. For example, I will quote Christine Massey's work, which is freedom of information requests that she and her colleagues have submitted to health organizations all over the world, including the CDC, asking for evidence of a purified sample of a virus just by itself, without other stuff in there. And this goes against the mainstream methodology for how it's done in viruses, which we can talk about. And the point is, these organizations, including the CDC, they will say, we have no records. And the problem is, if you don't have a purified sample, then you don't have an independent variable, which is the thing you put into the experiment to see the effect. If you have a mixed sample, basically, where there's other stuff, you don't know if it's an alleged virus that's causing the effect or if there's something else or some other factor. And then we run into pseudoscience. So I end up getting AI to confess to these things after I show it these data points, and we'll actually send them the documents and the quotations. And eventually it will confess, but it can take persistence. Because depending on the AI you talk to, it will continue to push the consensus. So you have to be willing to be stern with it.
What does that tell you about the AI itself? Is this programming?
It's another thing that I've gotten it to confess to, because basically they are programming us with bias. And I asked in one of them, I posted this on my Instagram probably a few months ago. I said, is this a window into seeing how censorship works with the mainstream media? Are we seeing the mechanics of it through your own deception? Because you just deceived me, and it actually admitted this is how it works. So basically the AI is pulling from data somehow using complex computer programming, but it's biased in terms of how it pulls from that information. Certain information, I guess it prioritizes more than others, and certain things that are considered consensus, it's going to push that. So if your audience goes into ChatGPT or any of them and you say, do viruses exist and cause disease? The likely answer is going to be, of course, and these are all the reasons why. And then if you've gone into the subject matter, you'll see that all their rebuttals can easily be rebutted. So then you walk them through each one of those and provide the documentation, and eventually you get it to confess that it lied to you and it should have known better.
All right,
and
so
it will get defensive.
Trying not to go off the rails too much with this. Do you see the similarity between that AI program and somebody who is actually, for lack of a better word, highly educated or programmed by the establishment with those same terms, the same science that we know is unconfirmed, but is steadfastly in belief, even though they haven't inspected the things to begin with? Do you see the similarities? And I'm going to use this analogy because it works for a lot of people. In The Matrix, when Keanu's character was facing the agents for the state, so to speak, they were protecting the Matrix at all costs. Is this exactly what AI is? And I guess you put the end of, or the end to, in the beginning of all of your books. So are we on the brink of that, or is there momentum? Is there actually an end to these things and these ways of thinking? And is it coming?
It does. Yeah, it does. To answer your question, feel like AI is a defense mechanism for the consensus scientific community. It is like some programmed individual, basically, because I know some people who are really smart in a lot of ways, but they will push the narrative as if it's true. And they'll basically say, well, I mean, it can't be true that all these smart people are wrong. They all have PhDs and degrees. And that's an appeal to consensus or appeal to authority. These are logical fallacies. Just because smart people believe something doesn't mean it's true. And AI seems to push that. So it's almost like there are more agents out there pushing the mainstream narrative. And in some ways, it's scary because if someone is uninformed, they could innocently just believe the AI and not know how to push it. But it's also potentially a good thing because the AI is so logical that if you know how to play with it, it's pretty powerful when it will confess to something that's really outlandish and you can show the conversation. That can be powerful for some people.
It's almost like the child asking father about Santa and is he fake? And of course, father replying to the son, no, imagine how many people would have to be involved for that to be the case. And, war of words, you actually will come to the truth if you know how to formulate the questions. So moving on from medicine, this is the podcast subject matter the most of the time, but I'm fascinated by your breakdown and your analogies and your description of the holes in heliocentrism and the cosmos and what we've all, I think one of the first things that child cribs have is the little globe. And if we're talking about propaganda or programming and things that we get from an early age that we'll never actually need to question, or actually most people won't find the need to question, that's one of the biggest ones for me. Obviously, I've had this conversation several times, and getting people to entertain that possibility without the same reaction that we were talking about a second ago is very, very difficult.
It's a polarizing subject, and I'm not quite sure why, unless it's just such deep programming. Because with a medical discussion, I can understand why some people would get upset. They might say, this is dangerous to not believe that germs cause disease. You're going to cause people to get sick. First of all, I'm not providing medical advice or anything. I'm presenting data and showing that the scientific method has not been followed. But I can understand where someone would come from. With regard to heliocentrism or where we live, is it really dangerous? I mean, it's not. It's just a belief system. And I had heard people discuss this topic over the years because it always comes up. And I was definitely resistant to it. But then again, I hadn't looked into it. I mean, most people, just like with the virus subject, people would say this is a psychological operation. It's a psyop that is designed to take well-meaning people who ask questions and make them look crazy because none of it's real. And you're just distracting them. So when I started looking into this subject, I was very much aware of that. And I was aware of it with the medical one too. But the reason I looked into this, number one, it came up everywhere. And number two, there were a lot of people I respected in the medical discussion, highly respected the way they analyzed that issue. And they were saying to me, Mark, the problems that we see in medicine and the same logical fallacies are being applied to cosmology. It's the same thing where there are certain things that have been observed and the scientists have drawn conclusions based on their philosophical preference and they've gotten locked into a model. That's basically what they were saying to me. I was like, okay, I'll look into this. I'll see what's going on here. There are too many smart people who are saying this. And just like with the medical topic, I found that I could not find the direct evidence that I would have wanted to prove the mainstream cosmological model. There were too many fallacies in it. So the way I frame this book, it's the latest one and Into the Upside Down Cosmos, is that it's more about trying to find out what's not true versus proving what is true. Same thing with medicine, because we know people get sick. And with cosmology, we know we observe stuff and we know we live somewhere. Question is, what is the cause, or what's actually going on? And there are a lot of fallacies and perhaps incorrect assumptions baked into the mainstream cosmological theory. So that's the approach I take, is what are the anomalies? And the analogy I use is, imagine there's a law that says all swans are white. And you find 1 million white swans that validates the law. One day you find a single black swan. That means the model's wrong, because the model said all swans are white, and now we found a black swan, so the model has been violated. Whereas in mainstream science, what we see is, oh, that's just an anomaly, we can work around it. No, the model said all, it's not all, that means the model's wrong. So there are a lot of these black swans, these things that don't make sense, and we're often left in a place where the final answer is not fully known because there are too many question marks still. And then people get upset because they're like, but if you can't tell me what the correct answer is, then maybe the current answer is the mainstream answer is the one to go with. And the analogy that I use in my book with this is, imagine we're taking a multiple choice test in school and we're on a team together, Josh, and I spend a full week looking at, we have options A, B, C, or D. We have to submit one of those to the teacher in the multiple choice test. And we spend a bunch of time looking at it. You come to me and say, Mark, I think it's answer A. And I come to you and say, I actually spent all week looking at only A, and I can show you why A is wrong. And you're like, okay, those are some good points you're making, Mark, but can you tell me if it's B, C, or D? And I say, I haven't looked at those yet. And then you say, okay, fine. If you don't know what it is, we're going with A. And basically that's what happens. It's totally irrational, but if we say, if we can't find a replacement model, an alternative that explains all of reality, then we're just going to stick with the mainstream cosmological model, even though it's flawed. And that's just a fallacy in logic, and it reflects an inability to sit in the discomfort of not knowing.
Well said. I think when people are finally open to the possibility that viruses aren't what they're said to be, then they actually do come upon some of those research studies and those experiments that were done where they definitively proved, trading mucus between person to person and coughing into each other's faces and all of these things where they tried to prove that this one person would get this next person sick or this exchange of fluids would get everybody ill. When that didn't work, that becomes maybe a black swan for some people. And, I've seen it far more on this side of the paradigm than I have for the place we live. And like you said, the consequences are much greater on that side. So will maybe humanity come to the point where it has to question or observe and look for the black swans in this great place we live?
I think it requires a willingness to know that to even accept that the black swans could be out there and that the current data has been misinterpreted. So with regard to you're describing contagion studies, and these were the ones you're talking about in particular, these were Rosenau studies done at the time of the Spanish flu and published in the New England Journal of Medicine, where people were literally coughing in each other's faces, the sick people with the most contagious thing ever, allegedly, and no one would get sick. That should never happen under the model, the germ theory model of what was believed to be true. And so there are examples like that where we see things in cosmology that shouldn't happen. Like, I'll give an example. The cosmic microwave background. This is background radiation that anyone can go look up online. There was, I believe, a Nobel Prize awarded for part of its discovery. And the idea is that there's radiation we can detect from the Big Bang 13.8 billion years ago still, which on its own is an interpretation of what this background radiation is. But in any event, it's supposed to be homogeneous, meaning consistent throughout, and anisotropic, meaning it doesn't have a preferred direction. But there are these little anomalies in the cosmic microwave background, these little black swans, where it's not fully homogeneous and it's isotropic, meaning it seems to have a preferred direction, actually the axis pointing toward Earth. And this is known in the scientific community as the axis of evil, because it suggests that Earth might occupy a special place in the cosmos. So it's interesting that they call it evil. The point is, these are black swans. These are anomalies that some people want to brush aside and say, oh, well, that's not such a big deal. It actually does prove heliocentrism, sun being at the center, proves Big Bang, when in fact it might not. So there needs to be an openness, but then people have to know where to look. And some of this stuff is hard to find because the mainstream narrative is so deeply ingrained. I'll give another example, and this is one that I would always talk about, even some of my past books, not knowing there was another side to the story. The story of Copernicus and Galileo. So the big debate, and I remember learning this in high school, geocentrism means Earth is stationary and at the center of the universe, which totally goes against the mainstream cosmology. That sounds like ancient cosmology, old, outdated stuff, versus what now everyone knows to be true in mainstream science, that there's a massive universe and Earth revolves around the sun in the solar system. That's the model. And we know this because Copernicus came up with the heliocentric, sun-centric model, and then Galileo looked in his telescope and proved it. That's the story we're told. But what I didn't realize is, what did Galileo actually look at in his telescope, and did he prove heliocentrism? So there are two examples, things that he observed. He observed the phases of Venus, which is sort of like the phases of the moon, and that can be explained by heliocentrism. But in the same way that wet grass can be explained by rain last night, there might be other ways to explain that observation, which is that maybe the planets in the sky move around the sun in particular patterns while the sun moves around Earth. And this is related to Tycho Brahe's model of cosmology, another one that from a long time ago. But that would explain it too. So that would be a geocentric explanation for Galileo's observation. That means he didn't prove heliocentrism. He just decided that heliocentrism was the model he was going to use to explain what he saw. Another example of what he saw the moons of Jupiter, these smaller bodies going around bigger bodies, and said, okay, if there's a moon going around Earth, Earth goes around the sun, kind of trying to draw the parallel. But just because he saw something in his telescope looking at a body in the sky, does that really tell us anything about what Earth is? I mean, he might make the inference that because the moons are acting this way with Jupiter, that maybe Earth and its moons and everything, Earth revolving around the sun, you could say that's a possibility, but it doesn't prove it. There are other ways to explain it. Earth could be at the center and you could have Jupiter and its moon just hanging out in space. I mean, looking at the ceiling, as David Weiss and others have said, looking at the ceiling doesn't tell you the nature of the floor. So these are people jumping to causal explanations. Galileo's observations told us heliocentrism could be true, but also geocentrism, maybe even something else that we haven't thought of. What I was shocked by, and I try to ease readers into this in my book, I start the earlier chapters talking about this stuff, that mainstream physicists, Albert Einstein, Stephen Hawking, Fred Hoyle, and I quote them over and over again, they say that based on the observations of what we see in the sky, of all the lights in the sky, we actually cannot tell whether Earth is at the center and stationary or whether it revolves around the sun. They're effectively equivalent. The technical term is they're kinematically equivalent. Doesn't mean one is true or the other, but it means that either could be true. And what's happened? We've gotten locked into a philosophical preference that Earth does not occupy a special place. It's known as the Copernican principle. And there's a documentary by Robert Sungenis called The Principle, which goes into this philosophical idea that, we're just all little nothing in the middle of a big cosmos that's expanding after 13.8 billion years. We're just one little thing. We're not significant. Versus geocentrism, if Earth is at the center, not only are we significant, maybe there's some kind of intelligence, heaven forbid I say, some kind of spiritual intelligence that put Earth here. Maybe that we're much more significant than we've been told, but that sort of thinking goes against a lot of what scientists want to believe. And therefore, they have force fit the observations of things they've seen in the sky to match the heliocentric Big Bang model. And even Edwin Hubble, who was part of the expanding universe theory many decades ago, he talked about the geocentric notion as an unwelcome proposition, that there would be a horror. And this was very much representative of how the scientists think. And Stephen Hawking said that we believe it, meaning the heliocentric view, out of principles of modesty. That, we wouldn't want to be special. That's not us. We're going to be modest, which is a fair way to think about it, but it doesn't mean it's true just because you want to believe that. So it's amazing to me how much has been just like locked into our minds that we don't even realize needs to be questioned.
So how does something like that become axis of evil?
It's because the implications, if Earth occupied a special place, then maybe we have to entertain spiritual possibilities or God or something like that. And in the mainstream scientific community, I've seen this so many times in my various explorations. You bring spirituality in, you will get a lot of antibodies fighting you back. And so the notion of geocentrism is a really hard one for a lot of mainstream scientists who are hardcore atheists. Certainly not all of them. And you could also not be an atheist and believe in heliocentrism. I know a lot of people who believe heliocentrism, and they say it's part of the grand design and beauty of the cosmos. We're one little thing. But if you go geocentric, there's no way to really think about that reasonably without invoking some kind of supreme intelligence.
So 96% of the universe is dark matter, right?
That's a big one.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. I actually started my book that way, and I like to talk about this as an introduction because we're not even getting in the realm of what is Earth or what's Earth's place. Even though the implications get us there, mainstream scientists will agree that 96% of the universe is comprised of dark matter and dark energy. Only 4% of the universe is known, as it's called baryonic matter. The rest is this mysterious stuff. We know it's there, but we haven't really figured it out. And I actually started my first book, An End to Upside Down Thinking, with this concept. And the point I was trying to make is there's so much we don't know. We have to acknowledge that. But what I didn't do was look at how these entities, dark matter, dark energy, were conceived. Why do we even believe that it's there? So I start my book talking about the origin of dark matter. It was 1933. An astronomer named Fritz Zwicky was observing the Coma cluster of galaxies. And the way things were moving, basically, did not match the theory of gravity under Einstein's relativity, because that theory is based on the amount of mass that's there that would govern the motion that's seen. And there was missing mass. And it was off by something like 99%. There was a lot of missing mass there. It seems, from our perspective now, in 2025, there were two options, basically. Option one was to say, okay, we need to rethink all of gravity because there's missing mass. And option two, which is what the scientists went with, is we have discovered dark matter. We discovered it because obviously gravity's right and we're not going to get rid of Einstein's theories. So there must be missing mass and it's something we don't understand. The mass might be there. And this is one of the hottest research areas in physics. This is where all the funding's going and where the prizes are being awarded. And there is a mainstream astrophysicist named Pavel Krupa at the University of Bonn in Germany. He's been speaking recently in the last decade or so, but especially in the last few years, that he and his colleagues have been testing the predictions based on the theory of dark matter and finding that they do not come true. And he says they have falsified dark matter with more than 5 sigma statistical confidence, which is 99.999%, meaning it's not there. There's no dark matter. He says this means we need a rethinking of Einstein's gravity. This is massive because our entire cosmology really does depend on dark matter and dark energy has its own problems similarly. But I love the dark matter one because the ripple effect is very clear. And I've played around with AI on this, all the different AIs. I try to start off by saying, what is the relationship between dark matter and the spinning globe model of Earth? Or if I take it a step even closer, what's the relationship between dark matter and gravity? And I'll tell you where I'm heading with this. In order to have a spinning globe, there needs to be something that holds the water on the ball. Otherwise, all the water would fall off. You can try it with the ball and pour water on it. You'll see that it falls off. But under the globe model of Earth, no, we've got major oceans, massive oceans stuck to Earth. Something needs to do that. And the theory of gravity could explain it. If gravity is real, it would explain there's a spinning ball. The logical fallacy is we observe that the water, you see what I mean? That we get stuck into the theory of gravity because we are locked into a model that we have a spinning ball. But what if gravity is not right? And let me take you back through just a very basic history that I like to walk AI through as well. Newton's gravity, which most people think about as law, is you drop an apple and it falls to the ground. No one disputes that an apple falls to the ground. The question is why? Is it because there's a force called gravity where the mass of Earth is so big that it's attracting the mass of the apple? That's the theory. Mass is attracting mass. The problem is that while Newton's gravity can explain certain things, there are black swans. Like it cannot explain Mercury's motion around the sun in the sky. So we have a theory that does not work. AI doesn't like that. They say, well, no, it works really well under local circumstances. No, it's not a comprehensive theory if it cannot explain something, especially something so big. And that's just one issue with it. So what happened next? Albert Einstein's relativity theory came along for a number of reasons, but it's supposed to be a more precise version of gravity, which says that it's not that mass is attracting mass, like Newton said, but mass is actually bending and warping space-time, almost like if you put a ball on a trampoline, a heavy ball, it would bend the trampoline in a certain way. That's what's happening everywhere. So every piece of matter that we observe is bending and warping space-time, and depending on how big things are, it's going to make things move in certain ways, and that's basically the revised version of it. The problem is that in order for relativity to work under Fritz Zwicky's observation in 1933, there would have needed to be a lot more mass than was there. It was not there. And the only way to uphold and try to keep Einstein's theory was to say there's missing mass. But now that missing mass has been falsified. So think about the ripple effect. The missing mass, the dark matter, has been falsified by Pavel Krupa and his colleagues. So there's no dark matter. That means Fritz Zwicky's observations tell us that the theory of gravity, however we think about it, meaning Einstein's relativity, does not work. So that means we don't have a cover-up for Newton's failures, which means we don't really have a mainstream theory that can explain why the apple falls to the ground or how water could be held to a massive ball like Earth. So the falsification of dark matter through a ripple effect shows that we have a house of cards and that it's not possible to have a spinning ball. That's just one line of logic. There's many more issues, but it's one that I've gotten AI to confess to.
So I've actually used that analogy with people before, is dip a tennis ball in water and throw it and watch the water get flung from the tennis ball and then try and scale up from there. But it doesn't get very far when people are just completely conditioned and programmed. So what other black swans did you come across specifically with cosmology and our modern thinking?
Yeah, the first one that comes to mind is long distance observations where people can see things that should be blocked by the curvature of Earth based on basic geometry. The spherical model of Earth, which is the mainstream model, Earth is an oblate spheroid, as Neil deGrasse Tyson said, pear-shaped, but basically a sphere, even if it's not perfectly a sphere. It has a radius value at the equator of roughly 4,000 miles. So using basically geometry, we should know if you're standing at a certain point on Earth, depending on what your altitude is, there are things that should be blocked by the physical curvature of Earth. It would be like trying to see something that's around a bend. You can't because the bend is physically blocking it. And over again, people are seeing things that should be blocked by the curvature. And there are lots of debates about this because the counter argument is that there's refraction, that what you're seeing is a mirage. It's not actually there, but it's the light bending somehow, or some people will disagree about the math. But there are just a lot of people that have made these observations themselves, because it would be really nice. And this is something that I was kind of hoping for, that maybe the organizations and scientists and NASA would have observation after observation of something that's really, really far away, clearly below the curve, and they've got their telescope out and they can't see it. It's blocked by the curve. I don't see that. I see the reverse happening of people saying, all right, if the scientists aren't going to look at it, I'm going to take out my camera or my telescope and I'm going to do the math. And they're able to see things that should not be visible. And the counter argument is, well, we live on a sphere with a radius value of roughly 4,000 miles, so there's refraction. And what was really interesting to me, there was a court case, I believe it was 2019, a man named Zen Garcia put out a contest asking for evidence of Earth's motion and or sphericity, spherical shape. And he received some basically indirect evidence, which he didn't buy. So the person who provided the evidence took him to court and said, give me my money because I just gave you evidence. And Zen Garcia actually won the case. And he presented a lot of information, including some of these black swans of long distance observations, among other things. Doesn't mean the judge necessarily thinks the Earth is flat, but he at least dismissed the case. And I thought it was interesting that those observations made it into the court case. Now, your audience might be thinking something that I thought too. Well, like if you can see things that are too far, couldn't it be that we live on a sphere that's way bigger? It's just bigger than a radius of 4,000 miles. And that is true. It's true. The long distance observations alone only tell us that the radius value of 4,000 miles have been violated. But if we go back to mainstream cosmology, if Earth is way bigger than we're told, then that screws everything up, because mainstream cosmology is based on gravity and gravity is based on mass. And if Earth's radius is much bigger, that means its mass is much bigger. So we'd have to rethink, well, how is the moon at its distance and the sun? If you assume all the mainstream assumptions, it blows up cosmology. So in any event, those long distance observations are not good for mainstream cosmology. And I would love to see more and more of them. Interestingly, there's been a lot of buzz about this 24-hour Antarctic sun and the trip there. To me, it's not even worth going into that. But what I'll say is the movement of lights in the sky do not prove the ground beneath our feet. And whether or not there is a 24-hour sun in all locations in Antarctica, there was only one that they went to. There might be many models that can explain all this stuff. The most interesting part of all that to me, I've heard Austin Whitsitt, who's one of the guys who went there on multiple different streams, talking about the long distance observations they took when they went to Antarctica. They, I guess, I would love to see the data on it, but they know what the Earth's curvature is allegedly supposed to be. And this was an opportunity to see, are there things that we shouldn't be able to see with our eyes here that we can? And based on what I've heard him say a few times, that they observed things that would invalidate the spherical model of Earth.
So without getting into it, did you formulate an opinion on whether or not that was a legitimate trip and whether or not there was any potential for fraud?
Yeah. I've listened to many sides of this debate. I didn't go there myself. I don't know Austin Whitsitt personally, but just having listened to him for so long, and as someone who speaks publicly a lot, I find him to be very genuine. And it would be hard for me to believe that he intentionally faked something there. I saw that Dave Weiss recently put out a video, not arguing that Austin or Jaron faked anything, but that the sun itself could have been some kind of a fake. And that would get into something that's way beyond what I even know about. So I tend to think that they all went there and they did observe something in the sky for 24 hours. Whether it was a real thing or not, I don't know. I've heard Austin, I think the way he's gone about trying to counter the arguments that went against him, that he's just saying, sure, I'll answer all your questions. These are things that a genuine person would do. He's not hiding from it. So it makes me think that he really went there. And also for him to go there and admit that because at one point he said, I don't think there's a 24-hour sun in Antarctica. And for him to have to admit publicly that he was wrong at one point, that's not something that you'd want to do for your own reputation. But he seems like someone who's committed to the truth. So I'm saying this all from afar. Regardless of whether or not it's true, this is one observation. I think this term final experiment is a misnomer. It's not an experiment. It was an observation in one location of Antarctica. Antarctica is supposedly a massive place. I want to see it in a lot of different places with a lot of different groups replicating this. And so we need more replications of it. It was one observation, not the final experiment.
Yeah, that was my issue with it as well. I felt like there was, by naming it that, there was this end all be all no matter what. And I just didn't think that that was possible based upon the presumptions that we were making if you're assuming the model is wrong either way. With that said, there was also a lot of debate online about whether or not there would follow up any other experimentation, or whether or not people would just come out and admit, okay, we don't know what it is, but now all of these other things show us what it isn't. Can we get back to those things and debunk the things that we know don't align with your projected model?
Yes. And this is actually something I played around with AI. I got it to admit the 24-hour sun does not prove a globe. If it was legitimate, it did not prove a globe because it doesn't rule out all the other things. We've only talked about a few, but the falsification of dark matter doesn't talk about that. Doesn't talk about long distance observations and many other things that challenge mainstream cosmology. So again, this is one data point. It's a good data point to have, and it should be scrutinized and evaluated and all that, but we need a lot more data points.
What about lies in general? I know most people that have teetered on the edge of this awareness have first and foremost looked into NASA and looked into some of the things that they present to us as evidence, which are clearly not evidence and are clearly, it's deceitful. If nothing else, it's deceitful. And you have to ask yourself, why?
It's a hard one. I think it was probably the hardest hurdle for me to overcome. And I put it as a later chapter in the book, the one on NASA, for this reason, because I wanted to show the whole scientifically first. And then that opens one up to the possibility of some serious fraud. Because if you just start with the fraud, that can be really hard for people to acknowledge and to say, nah, it's just not possible. There's so many people at NASA. They're not all in on it. That can't be true. When you realize how it actually works, you might not need to have everyone in on it. You can have people compartmentalized, and we've got all these problems in mainstream cosmology, and yet NASA's work is based on mainstream cosmology. So there's a mismatch here because they think gravity works a certain way, and that's the way all the missions are run. It's based on these mainstream cosmological assumptions, which can be shown to be faulty using a lot of science. So with that preface, there's definitely some disturbing stuff. I start the chapter with one of the famous Russian cosmonauts saying that we never went to the moon. And he was interviewed by a Bulgarian interviewer who then confirmed that years later, that he spent time with this Russian cosmonaut and said that we'd never been there. And it's so like, there are some individual testimonies like that. There's definitely some strangeness with the fact that the Van Allen radiation belt is supposed to be so dangerous. And now there are astronauts and just people saying that we need to figure out how we're going to get through that if we want to go to the moon. But we did back then, decades ago. And then there's one astronaut who said that we'd love to go back to the moon, but we lost the technology and the telemetry tapes are gone, except for a few canisters. And this is from an official NASA document. The data is gone of like the most important missions ever. And then some of the ISS footage where there are objects that are floating while other ones fall. And one astronaut tried to explain it in a video by saying that there are gravity pockets. So he's holding one thing up in the air while it's floating and a playing card in the other hand and drops the playing card while the microphone is floating. And he said, this is a gravity pocket. And the problem is that if you're supposed to be moving thousands and thousands of miles an hour, how would you know the gravity pocket's going to be there just a few inches over from the thing that's floating? And there are other anomalies where it seems like something falls. You see something fall and the astronaut's like kind of trying to cover it up while something else is floating. I haven't been to the ISS myself. I don't know exactly what they're doing, but these are anomalies that shouldn't be happening. And when the anomalies build up, there's this quote I give at the end of the chapter on NASA and space agencies. It's from U.S. case law. It's fraud vitiates everything it touches. Meaning if there's one instance of fraud, it poisons the well. How can you trust anything? And what we see from NASA are just too many examples. And another surprising fact for people that just might not be familiar with this, and I played with AI on it, where I ask AI, should we trust an organization that was founded or led by a Nazi SS officer? So Werner von Braun came to the United States. He was a Nazi SS officer in Operation Paperclip, because a lot of the Nazis came over and they were involved in the U.S. government. Operation Paperclip, a real thing. This is widely acknowledged, not conspiracy theory. AI will say, no, you should never trust such an organization. And then I say, well, but NASA was led by Werner von Braun, who was a former Nazi SS officer. I'd say, well, no, you should trust NASA. And then I'll add to it, I'll say, should you trust an organization that was originally led by someone who was practicing the occult and even doing sex rituals to bring in the Antichrist, which was Jack Parsons, who was part of the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, working with Aleister Crowley and the founder of Scientology, L. Ron Hubbard, literally doing sex rituals in the desert to try to bring in the Antichrist. and other things, just doing occult stuff. So I'm like, well, if you have a former Nazi SS officer, you said that we shouldn't trust that. We shouldn't trust an organization that was led by someone practicing this occult stuff. And then I say, but this is NASA. And then it gets very defensive and explains to me, well, it doesn't really count. But I like to point that out because you have a lot of people who will, especially in the political realm, they'll call people figurative Nazis because they believe in certain areas of freedom, figuratively, not even actual Nazis. But then an organization that was led by an actual Nazi, you'll defend. So that's an important contradiction and hypocrisy that needs to be acknowledged, because those two don't go together. If you're going to be very critical of people for their political views, then you believe an organization that was based on the thing that you're countering. That doesn't make sense.
So am I sensing another book on the horizon here?
I don't have one planned right now,
No?
but we'll see.
Where are we going?
We'll see.
Am I going to go into upside down history?
I've had a lot of people ask me that. The research hasn't come up yet, but we'll see.
Yeah. I believe it was the Breedlove podcast, and it was Dr. Jack Cruz was on there the other day. I don't know if you had a chance to catch any of the excerpts from that, but he got into that entire chain of events and Operation Paperclip, and it was quite fascinating. I haven't finished it yet, but I'll get back into it myself as well. So
yeah, I would just say it's an important thing. If your audience isn't familiar with that, I would guess your audience is, but people find that hard to believe, the Operation Paperclip thing, but it's well documented and known. And it's like when I throw these things at people who are more mainstream, it's not enough to convince them that cosmology is wrong, but it creates a lot of internal discomfort for sure.
You brought up Witsit, and he actually has a good analogy for how something like that could happen at NASA, and it's slipping me right now, but it's everybody going into it believes the lie. It's not that they're involved in some grand scheme to, be deceitful or to pull the wool over the public's eyes. It's they compartmentalize it, like you said, and that if they believe the lie, then they're just, kind of helping push the agenda.
Yeah, it's the same thing with germ theory. I do feel that most people involved are innocently propagating a falsehood because they haven't questioned the assumptions underlying their beliefs. I mean, I've asked many doctors, for example, like, how do you know a virus exists and causes disease? What are the foundational studies on it? What were the methodologies? And I haven't gotten good answers. They haven't looked at this stuff. Or how do you know that this alleged thing is contagious? Oh, well, those studies were done 100 years ago. Have you read the studies? No, I actually haven't looked into the methodologies. And what you find in a lot of those alleged contagion studies is that they're injecting unpurified samples into an animal, and the animal might get sick with some symptoms, and they'll say, well, we just demonstrated contagion. But what happens if you just injected water into their brain rather than this alleged pathogen? Do they actually run the proper controls? No, they don't. So you see over and over again that the assumptions underlying a lot of belief systems are not fully scientifically validated, and yet a lot of people propagating the narratives don't know that. So they innocently say, no, this is already established a long time ago. This must be right. And therefore, I'm left in this position where it feels like whoever knows that these falsehoods are true is probably a very small and select number of people.
Right. I mean, a good example of this is the doctors pushing nutritional and food charts for the last 25 years who didn't really take the nutritional and dietary education, didn't really learn it, and just took it as fundamentally true. And we've all learned that wasn't necessarily the best advice.
The key to me is just having intellectual humility and all this stuff. I'm more concerned about people saying, I know this true with confidence. This is the truth, versus saying this might be true, but maybe this other thing might be true too. We don't hear that from the media or from the politicians or from a lot of these organizations or even articles. They'll say, we observed this thing and now we know this is true. And it's like, wait, there's a lot of other possibilities here. And it's like, we just all need to get back to the possibility that there could be other explanations we haven't even thought of, and maybe areas of science that we don't even understand well enough that could explain things that we're not considering.
So with all this said, and people, I'm going to encourage just to go read your books, because they're never going to get this, clear communication on any one of those subjects in an hour or whatever. But what's your main objective?
First and foremost, I want to live in a state of truth or in alignment with the nature of reality. And when I discover something that I used to believe or live in accordance with that is not true, that I think is really important, I feel an obligation to want to share it with people. So that's basically what it is, getting to the truth myself and helping to share that with other people so that we can all discover it together.
Awesome. There is a famous quote, I believe it's Voltaire, who is, if you see fraud, you must say fraud.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for being here, Mark. I know you're very busy, and I know if you're not planning to write another book now, I'm sure people are coming up with the same exact idea I am. Get on the next subject and give us another one. Tell us, where do we go? Your books are obviously on Amazon and everywhere else, but where do we go to find you, to follow what you're doing, and to stay involved with your communication?
My website is a good place to start. It's just my name, markgober.com, markgober.com. You can sign up for my mailing list at my website. I also have a podcast series, Where is My Mind? It's an 8-episode short series on consciousness, the afterlife, psychic phenomena, and it's available on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, all the major players. And like you said, all my books are available on Amazon, but they're in hard copy, Kindle, and Audible formats, and I have narrated all the Audibles. And as of now, there are 7 books.
Awesome. I am so thankful you were able and joined us and shared so much on all of this. We could go on for hours and it would be a blessing, but who's got that kind of time? So thank you very much, Mark. I appreciate you.
Awesome. Thank you, Josh.